Hey everyone, Harold Fisher here again, anchor and host of the Daily Drum on WHUR. Welcome to another edition of HUR at Home on WHUR.com and all of our social media platforms. Tonight, we're talking about an issue that is literally black and white. Until he was 34 years old, Michael Fosberg thought he was white. But his search for his father revealed something very different. It revealed that he is actually biracial. And he talks about his personal journey in his new book, Nobody Wants to Talk About It, Race, Identity, and the Difficulties in Forging Meaningful Conversations. Mr. Fosberg, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. It is an honor to talk to you.
Pleasure, Harold, pleasure. It's great to be on your show.
Absolutely. And just for our viewers, we've been chopping it up already quite a bit. So, I mean, we've gone through so much, but there's still so much to talk about. Briefly talk to me about why you didn't know that you were biracial.
How couldn't you not know?
Because our kinfolk,
right.
I would look at you and I'd say, "Oh, there's a brother right there."
Well, that's because you got black dar. I say the black people got black dar, so that's
right. We have black dar, absolutely.
Right. Well, I grew up in a working class white family in the northern suburbs of Chicago, and I was raised by my biological mother, who was Armenian descent, and an adoptive stepfather who was Swedish. And when I was in my early 30s, my parents announced that they were getting a divorce, and I realized that my mother had never told me anything about my biological father. And so I decided it was time to go out and search for him. And I only had two bits of information. I knew his name, and I knew the last time that she had spoken with him, which was some 30 years prior, that he lived in the Detroit area. So armed with that information, this is the age before we used the internet for everything. I went to the library. Libraries used to have phone book sections. Remember phone books?
I do.
Yeah, they used to have a phone book section.
They still may in some.
Probably, maybe. And they would have phone books from major cities from across the country. So I went and looked for the Detroit phone book. I looked up his name. It was John Sidney Woods. And there were about 5 listings. And I copied down all the names and numbers. And I raced home to my little tiny apartment. It was about the size of his screen. And I got the courage and I picked up the phone. I dialed the first number on the list. The guy answers the phone and I said, "I'm looking for a John Sidney Woods." And he says, "You're speaking with him." I was like, oh my gosh, it can't be that easy, right? I mean, it couldn't be that easy. And so I had developed these questions that I thought I would ask. So I said, well, did you live in the Boston area in 1957? Because that's where my mother met my father when she was in college at Boston University. And he kind of paused and he said, "Yes, I did." And then I said, "Were you married to a woman by the name of Adrian Piliposian," which is my mother's maiden name, as an Armenian name? And he paused again for what seemed like an hour. And he said, "Yes, I was." And I realized I tracked my dad down the first phone call. And so we were talking. I'm trying to wrap my head around, "You're my dad." He's trying to wrap his head around, "You're my son." And then out of the blue, he says to me, "Son, there's a couple of things you should know. I'm sure your mother's never told you." And I was like, okay, aside from not telling me about you, I mean, what else could there be, right? And he says, "Well, first of all, I want you to know that no matter what you were told or what you thought happened, I've always loved you. And I've thought about you a lot." This was my dad telling me that for the first time. I was absolutely elated. And then he said, "There's one other thing I'm sure your mother's never told you." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I'm African American." And I remember I was standing in a little tiny room, remember, and I'm standing next, there was a full length mirror next to me. And I kind of caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, like, wait a minute, did I just change? And then he proceeded to tell me my family history. I have a great-great-grandfather who was a member of the 54th Regiment in the Colored Infantry Unit in the Civil War. My great-grandfather was an all-star pitcher in the Negro Leagues. He was Charles Lefty Robinson. My grandfather was a genius, and the science building at Norfolk State University is named after him. And I was like, wait a minute, whoa, can we get back to the black part? Because I'm still trying to wrap my head around that. and you asked me the question, so how did I not know? Like, there wasn't anything in my white family to suggest that I was anything but what they were. I mean, I know I didn't know my biological father, but it never occurred to me that my biological father could be black. And I think that is a part of of having white privilege, of not being able to think outside the box, that I could have a black father. And
that's amazing. So you were 34 years old. I mean, you were very much an adult.
That's correct.
At the time. Did you have a conversation with your mother as to why she did not tell you?
Yes. Well, so my mother was from an Armenian family, Armenian immigrants who came to this country in the early 1900s. They came suffering a great indignity. They were a part of the massacre of the Armenians by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm. My grandfather saw his parents slaughtered and killed. He was made a slave to a Turkish family. I have slavery on both sides of my family, and on the black side and on my Armenian side. So when they came to this country, they were not unlike other immigrants that came to this country or still come to this country. There's a strong component in immigrant families to marry one of your own. And that was passed on to my mother. And the fact that my mother was with a black man was completely unacceptable to them. And so it was very much not talked about at all in my family. They even when my mom got married and then, and had me as a kid, they didn't talk about it. Her parents disowned her. And then when we left my father and went home to live with my grandparents for a while, and then my mom remarried, no one ever said a word. And my mom held that guilt and that shame all these years because of the pressure from her immigrant family.
What did she tell you?
What did she tell me when I finally confronted her? Well, I mean, she was obviously very, very nervous that I had found all this information out, and she was ashamed. And I have to tell you that a very dear friend of mine had called me just before I called my mother to confront her with this information. Mm-hmm. And I told him how angry I was at my mother, and he said, no, you have an opportunity here to absolve your mother of the shame that she has held all these years. You have an opportunity to help her let it go. And I realized what he was really saying to me was it was time to practice forgiveness. It's the most difficult work that you will ever do, but also the most rewarding. And I realized what kind of a situation my mom was in, living in Boston in the projects in 1957, 58, and how difficult and ostracized she felt from her family and from other people. And she was just trying to raise her kid the best as she knew how as a 19, 20-year-old kid.
Did you meet your father?
I did meet my father. I met my father and my grandparents were still alive.
Wow. What was that like?
Oh my gosh, it was unbelievable. I remember I met my grandparents first, actually, and I went to visit them. They lived in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and my granny was just the embodiment of love. They welcomed me with open arms. They had a soul food on the table ready to go. It was awesome. And then my father was coming that afternoon. My grandfather went to pick him up. He brought him in. My father walks in the room, and I tell you, it was like looking in a mirror. I mean, I look exactly like my father. We move the same. I move my hands the same. I tilt my head the same as him. It was uncanny.
What was that first in-person conversation like with him?
Well, it was very tearful. I can tell you that. We were both. And my father being from, another generation, a generation that didn't necessarily show a lot of emotion. He was tearing up. It was definitely, just joyful and sad because we had missed so many years together, especially my grandparents. It was just an amazing conversation with them. My grandfather was just so elated to have me back in the family. Grandparents are very protective of their grandchildren. And so he and I had established a really great rapport over the ensuing years. So yeah, it was just really incredible to be able to sit there with all those emotions flowing through all of us in that room that day.
I guess it's a good thing you turned out okay.
I guess it is. Well, I will say in some ways, people say like things happen for a reason. And my grandmother used to say that to me, and I have to say, I'm on this journey. This journey happened in the way that it happened for a reason. I realize I'm here today to carry this message. So what I've been doing for the past 15 years is I turned my story into a one-man play. where over about 50 minutes, I portray over a dozen different characters. And I started doing it in theaters, and then it moved into doing it for high schools and colleges, and then corporations and government agencies and military bases. And what I've done is I perform the play, and then following the play, I guide the audience on a dialogue about race and identity. And I get them to open up and have an uncomfortable conversation. And I give them tools on how to have that uncomfortable conversation. So the book that you mentioned, nobody wants to talk about it, Race, Identity, and the Difficulties in Forging Meaningful Conversations, is about my journey over the past 15 years, telling this story in the form of a one-man play, and all the crazy stories that happened to me over the years, all these people who wanted to talk but didn't know how to talk, or stumbled over themselves, or said offensive things, or whatever it might be. And I tell these stories in the book, and I highlight these 7 tools that I learned, which in the first tool is tell your story. It's in our stories that we find commonalities, and we have more in common than we have different. And so I use that premise as a way to get people to open up and have dialogue about race and identity.
How did your life change? You said 60?
Coming up on 63.
Coming up on 63.
Yeah.
So half of your life you've lived as a white person, and now the rest of your life you've lived as a biracial person. I mean, first of all, how do you identify? I mean, do you identify as biracial, Black?
Right.
Not at all. And how has your life changed?
Yes, well, identity is a complicated issue, which I talk a great deal about with lots of audience members, both in educational institutions and corporations. Identity is something that each of us comes to in our own way, in our own shape, in our own form. And it can be different in a family. In an immediate family, a mother, father, son, and daughter, each one of them will come to their identities in a different way and form a different identity. Yes, there are definitely things that the family members share. But some family members are more into music, and music becomes their identity, or food becomes their identity, or sports becomes part of their identity, a key part. So each of us comes to it in a different way. Race, obviously, a very, very complicated identity. Some days I identify as biracial. Some days I identify as Black. Some days I identify as white. It changes constantly. And I think for many of us, that identity journey that we're on changes over the course of our lives. Little things such as you become a parent and you get married, and now you see yourself as a spouse. You become a parent. Now you see yourself as a parent. You have children. Your children have children. Then you see yourself as a grandparent. And so that's a simplistic way, but to show you that how our identities change over our lifetimes. As far as what I've learned, I've learned that. I've learned how our identities change. I've learned how to walk into a room and feel completely comfortable, and to be able to feel uncomfortable and to sit with it in that room. I've learned how to make my life has become so much richer and fuller because I've been on this journey. It's just been amazing. People have opened up to me. I can't tell you, after I do presentations, and now, of course, in COVID, I'm doing these presentations online. We just developed 2 new virtual programs, which many corporations and government agencies are lining up to take part in. And what happens is people come up to me and tell me the deepest, darkest, most intimate secrets and intimate stories about their lives, because my telling my story opens people up to tell their story. And therein, again, we find these commonalities.
You made a point that I find interesting.
Yeah.
In telling your story, and obviously you have this effervescent personality. As a result, do you believe that it may have more to do with your personality, your openness, your glee, and willing to have the conversation that has allowed this not to be as difficult a journey as it could be for someone who did not have the kind of personality that you have?
Sure, that's a excellent question. It's complicated. So before I started doing this, I have been most of my life an actor, writer, director, teacher. And now, stating that, one would think, well, my gosh, you're an actor. You get up and perform on stages, and you're, comfortable with all of that, and you're probably outgoing and an extrovert. Actually, I wasn't so much before this journey happened to me. I was a kind of actor who was really dedicated to my craft, but I was fine if you gave me some lines to say on stage, but off stage, or like if I'm in a room with people and you have to raise your hand to ask a question, I was very timid and very intimidated by doing that kind of thing. But since I've gone on this journey, this story, this life journey has really given me confidence and an understanding of what a complete picture I am today. Like, being raised, I didn't know all of who I was. I mean, I had just a small picture. My mom, told me I was Armenian, and she just kind of made up stuff on the other side. At one point, she told me she thought maybe I was Cherokee Indian, which is, that's a whole nother story in the Black community, right?
It is. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So she just threw that out there, and I grabbed onto that, but that didn't sit right with me. It never felt right for some reason. And so I never had this complete picture of who I was. So when I went on this journey and I discovered all this stuff, and I started to open the door and allow myself to bring all of this stuff, let all of this stuff enter, I found that I lost all of that anxiety, that I lost this intimidation. And I feel, like I said before, like I feel really, really comfortable going into any kind of a space, any kind of a room. And I'm even comfortable, and this is one of the tools that I've learned, I'm even comfortable being uncomfortable, because that's a place that we need to be in having this conversation about race and identity. It's an uncomfortable conversation. Yes. And we need to be comfortable with that. And I learned that having this journey.
Well, and let us say that, as you know, for most Black people, they are not uncomfortable with it because they live with it every day.
That's correct.
Because they have been born into it. But did you ever have an opportunity as a young adult, prior to finding this out, where dealing with your career, whether it be students or some other, where somebody, a Black person, came up to you and gave you as we were talking about earlier, that black dark conversation. Did that ever happen to you? And you said, "Oh no, I'm a white guy."
They gave me the brother handshake.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yes, a lot of times, a lot of friends came up to me and said, "Oh, you must have some Black in you," or something. Right. A lot of people said this to me growing up. But again, there wasn't anything in my family.
No point of reference.
No, there wasn't anything to show that I was anything but what they were. So I laughed with them, and I had a good time with it. I remember I was one of two white guys on my high school basketball team, although of course I wasn't, but I didn't know that at the time. and I went to my, I don't know, what was it, my 40th class reunion? I don't even, who's keeping track? I think I went to my 40th class reunion not so many years ago, and I saw the brothers from the basketball team, and I went up to them and I said, "You are never going to believe what's happening to me," right? And I told them the story, and they were like, "Oh, we always knew that about you. Had the hair. You were like, yeah, we always." And I'm like, "It's easy for you to say that now."
And they saw you dance at the prom.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, that's hilarious. What advice would you give to someone who is wondering? Because as wonderful as this story is, it is not unusual.
Right.
And so for someone who may be watching this right now or may see it later, and they begin to look in the mirror and wonder about their background, what advice would you give them to talk to their parents about it if there have always been questions that are unanswered? And also, what advice would you give to them as they begin to look at their own identity?
Well, a couple of things. One, I would say my story is just as much about family secrets as it is about race. And every family has a secret. Every family has a secret. And I think it's important to try to uncover those things from a place of respect and love, because those secrets are not there because people are trying to hurt people. Those secrets are there because people are shamed or guilty or whatever it might be. And it's difficult to unearth that stuff. The second thing I would say is, and I give this advice to a lot of young people who come up to me who are searching for a parent or whatever, is this is one of the most difficult things, is try not to have any expectations. I know that's impossible. We have expectations of what's going to happen after this interview and what's going to happen later tonight and tomorrow morning. We have all kinds of expectations that we've already got in our brain. But if you walk into the journey and the relationship having expectations, you're only going to get disappointed. So it's important, try not to have expectations.
This is truly fascinating, and I just want to say, when the pandemic is over,
yes,
we certainly pray that it will be.
Yes, soon.
We need to make sure that your performance comes to Washington, D.C.
Yes.
I think, certainly, I'm sure. How many characters?
About a dozen.
About a dozen characters.
Yeah.
I
was supposed to be there last week. I was supposed to do something for the Department of Homeland Security.
Wow.
But it got delayed, and now we're going to do it virtually. So, and I want to just mention to your listeners and watchers that they can follow me at incognitotheplay.com. It's all one word, incognitotheplay.com. I'm not on social media, and there's a good reason for that. I don't believe social media promotes truth, and it doesn't promote dialogue. And I'm all about truth and dialogue. And so I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. But really, if you want to find out more about the book, you can get the book at the website, incognitotheplay.com. You can find out where I'm going to appear when we start moving around again. Yeah, I'd love to come back to DC.
Really, really looking forward to seeing something like that, because that's just fascinating to me. And with 12 characters, I'm sure your wife finds it very entertaining.
Yes.
Who am I dealing with tonight, Michael?
Schizophrenic.
Yeah. Boy, I tell you, look, I really, really appreciate you spending some time with us. Congratulations on the book. And I would argue that even at almost 63, this world of discovery is still, part of a wonderful path for you. This is not the end.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending some time with us as well.
It's great.
Absolutely. Michael Fosberg, the author and actor. That is it for this edition of HUR at Home. I'm Harold Fisher. And as always, I will see you on the radio.